stream. All right, officially then, welcome back. Can you all see my purple slides window? Okay, excellent. Then we started talking about construct maps last time, and that had a series of questions about what does it mean to have a trait that's continuous versus not. I think that in my heart of hearts, I believe that most traits probably are continuous, right? People can vary from each other in a multitude of tiny increments. The only question that we have is how well we can actually differentiate among those increments. All of the models that we're going to be talking about in this class are presupposing that we have a trait that is continuous. So you can think about being low on the trait, medium on the trait, and high on the trait. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. I am muting all of you, but please unmute and interrupt whenever you'd like. That is in contrast to other sorts of latent models that presuppose that instead of having a continuous trait, you have a grouping of some kind. So those fall under the names of like latent class analysis, latent profile analysis. Those are the exploratory versions. Latent transition analysis, which is a longitudinal version of latent class analysis. And then the closest analog to the item level measurement models that we'll be talking about is diagnostic classification models or cognitive diagnosis models. They have latent traits that are categorical. They're called attributes instead. So we won't have a chance to go over those models in this class, but hopefully you can pick up another class on that at some point during your stay here. So we're talking about traits that are continuous in this class. Items, indicators can be anything. So as part of the initial set of slides in this lecture, I have sort of a hierarchy of what the names are that go with the responses, but just know that you can fit a latent trait model no matter what kind of response you have. So responses themselves can be continuous, they can be binary, they can be ordinal, they can be nominal, they can be counts, they can be skewed and continuous, they can be normal and continuous, they can be anything. So those distinctions aren't as big as the sort of what kind of trait are you modeling distinctions. Continuous traits in every case for the models that we're going to talk about in this class. So we were looking at, let me get this thing blown up here. Construct maps, the idea of being able to conceptualize the trait that you're measuring in terms of an ordering of people as well as an ordering of items. So I think this is a lot easier to do with some types of traits than others and with some types of items than others. But one of the byproducts of the analyses that we'll get when we get into latent trait measurement models, and in particular item response models, is literally an ordering of items and response options. And so you'll see this idea come back in an empirical way later on in the course. So we looked at a couple examples of these, and then we were talking about instrument construction. And I think we were round about here. So, right? Does this sound right? Maybe? Ish? Okay, well, that's what I say. So instrument building blocks. There's a lot of ways that people can go about creating a brand new instrument, but the way that is recommended in the Constructing Measures book that I recommended last time, as well as other sources, is this idea that you start with the construct. Like, what do you want to measure? And in what context do you want to use it? So context differs, right? You can have the same trait be operationalized in different ways depending on what your end goal is. But whatever construct you're measuring then dictates what kind of indicators or items are relevant to assess that. And so that should be sort of a theoretically guided process. It's hard to know whether or not you've selected or created appropriate items, though, until you do your analyses on the back end to try and confirm your ideas about which items are supposed to measure which traits. The items then guide you towards what kind of response space is going to be most appropriate. And one of the common themes that I want you to take away from the rest of this lecture is that one size does not fit all. There is not a universal rule, no matter what some people might say, that all items have to have at least 5 choices. or that 7 choices is better than 5, or that you can't have just 3, right? The kind of item that it is should logically guide what the choices are and how many choices are actually differentiable. Because it doesn't do any good to go from 3 choices to 5 choices to 7 choices if people cannot reliably distinguish what the choices mean. What kind of response space you end up working with then in turn dictates which kind of measurement model is going to be most appropriate. So where most SEM classes start is confirmatory factor analysis, which is the latent variable analog to regression. It says that I have a continuous predictor, that's my trait, and that I am assuming that my items are continuous and normally distributed. Probably unlikely. I honestly have never come across a real data example where the items were actually continuous and normally distributed. Best case scenario is that we have some kind of ordinal response format, maybe 5 or 7 choices, where most people pick something in the middle and it looks normal-ish, right? That's much more common. But regardless of what kind of response space you have, your job is to identify which kind of measurement model best fits that. And this is where I had, as part of your initial preparation for this class, suggested some material from my spring class, which is on generalized linear models. The same set of decision-making points that you go through in deciding, say, what kind of regression model fits, whether it should be a logistic regression or a multinomial regression or a count regression or a linear regression, all that stuff directly lends itself to this too. And so it's not that IRT is somehow better than CFA, right? They're for different kinds of items. So once you have your measurement model fitted to some kind of data, that way you get empirical evidence as to the structure that you're hypothesizing, then hopefully your estimates of the traits can then inform one standing on the construct. In reality, this is an iterative process. If you're planning on doing instrument development, plan at least 3 studies because you're not going to get it right the first time. And it's almost impossible to predict all of the things that are not going to be exactly as you anticipated. And even if you are to luck out and you end up with a great set of items, you want to make sure that the decisions that you've made in terms of which items you might want to keep or eliminate, you would make again on a different sample. You don't want to be lulled into a false sense of security by making sample-specific idiosyncratic decisions that wouldn't replicate. So this is an iterative process. Even if you're working with a measure that is relatively well developed, meaning there's a lot of uses of it, it's the onus is still on you to make sure that the original assumptions underlying the way that the items relate to the traits are actually supported in your sample. So measurement is not something that's like just done and then you could use the measure. It should be viewed as an ongoing process. So the book Constructing Measures talks about this idea of building instruments as a logical argument and thinking about not just what indicators would be appropriate, but all of the things that go along with that. What language do you use? Do you ask people to self-report things, or is it imperative to get some sort of converging evidence from other reports? What do you do? Like you'll have to plan ahead if reports don't agree. So there's a lot of literature suggesting, for example, that if you ask a child's teacher about problematic behavior, the reports from the teacher may not necessarily coincide with the reports from, say, the child's parent. Does that mean that one of them is right and one of them is wrong? Or do they have different but equally valid viewpoints? These are the things that you sort of have to wrestle through in advance and thinking about how your measure is going to be used. Um, so the steps that are sort of espoused but are easier said than done, literature review, sort of what's been done before and where does your measure fit into that. No one wants to make a brand new measure if you don't have to. Um, even if there are measures out there that ostensibly reflect the same latent construct, reasons to make a new one might be differential sensitivity. So as an example, I got some press for an IES grant that was recently funded, a collaborative project that I'm doing with Kate Saunders at the University of Kansas. And her goal was to build a new measure. Yes, thank you for the applause. Yes, yay me, I got grant money. It finally happened after submitting like 8,000 grants. but that's a whole nother story. Um, IES finally decided to fund our proposal after like 5 years of trying. That's the backstory to that, right? No grants are ever funded on the first try. But anyway, uh, her goal is to measure pre-reading abilities, um, the alphabetic principle in particular, which is related to but not the same as phonemic awareness. And she was concerned about two aspects of existing measures. One was that the existing measures all required spoken responses. So you have to read an item to a child and say, what do these two letters put together? What do they say? And they have to speak and respond. Well, that automatically knocks out children who have speech issues, right? Because they may not be able to properly say the answer, even if like they know what it should be. And so she wanted to develop a measure that didn't require spoken responses so that it would be more fair and more accurate for children from different kinds of populations. And she was also concerned about existing measures being too high and wanting to better measure children who were at the lower end of development. So, 3-year-olds as opposed to 5-year-olds who are going to get, zeros on all of the items. That doesn't help the teacher tell, figure out what to do next, right? If they can't get anything right. And so those were her goals, and we were able to make a successful argument to IES to fund this line of research to, even though there's measures that arguably are of similar constructs, why our approach is going to give you something new. So it's always a question of what are you bringing to the table that isn't there already. And for your first assignment, by the way, you'll get a chance to focus on the second part here. If you're dealing with an existing instrument that's been administered 1,000 times, what is the actual evidence for its psychometric properties? If you are dealing with an instrument that was created before, say, 1995, odds are good there's not much. People may have since then done psychometric work on it, but at the time, latent trait models were very hard to get to estimate. Computing isn't what it is now. And so you may find yourself very surprised at what the initial evidence was for some of these measurement tools. So that's something to think about too, is that even if there's something that's accepted, what really is the evidence for its use in the way that people are currently proceeding? So we have item design, response format issues to think about, and then actually getting feedback is imperative. Do people understand what your questions are asking, and can they respond in a way that you would anticipate? So these are common guidelines as to what makes good items. Items should be clear. They should only reflect one idea. If your item has the word and in it, that's generally bad, right? Because there's two ideas in there and they could agree with one and disagree with the other, and the response is ambiguous as to what it means. You want the items to cover the construct well, but not too specifically. If you have a bunch of items that are basically saying the same thing over and over again, you can end up with a scale that looks like it's very reliable, but then it's of questionable validity, meaning to what extent have you actually measured what you think you have. The term for that is called a bloated specific. You may see that term in the literature, and that's something to avoid in this process of trying to figure out which items to keep and which items to remove. Thinking about common stems or valences is another thing that you can another set of decisions to wrestle with, whether or not you have reverse coded items, for instance. It used to be very common that people would recommend, oh, you need to have some of the items worded in a positive direction, and then you also need to include items in a negative direction. That way people don't just say agree, 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 agree without looking. But that ends up creating more problems than it solves. It turns out that saying the opposite of something is not the same thing as an absence of that opposite. So if I have a scale measuring happiness and I have items on there measuring sadness, is being happy the same thing as not being sad? Eh. So, like, if someone gives you, let's say that you give someone a birthday present and they open it in front of you and you say, do you like it? And they say, I don't hate it. Do they like it? Probably not, but they don't hate it. So that kind of thing, right? If you word it in the opposite direction, are you still on the same construct or have you merged onto a different construct? Introducing more than one direction can inadvertently introduce a different construct. There's an article about that on your reading list that I thought they did a nice job of talking about those opportunities as well. I
Can
have
I
some,
mention?
yeah, please go
Sorry.
ahead.
Can I about that? I'm working on a survey where there's like 4 out of maybe 12 are reverse coded, and we like adjusted a little bit of wording in several of them to see if we could get closer to what we thought the construct was. And the difficulty between like the first version and the second version changed the most in the items that were reverse coded,
Mm.
um, making us think that like maybe those were just the most confusing to begin with, and like that's why they were just misinterpreted, and that's why there was more of a difference in difficulty between the two versions.
Yes, people are bad at processing negative information. Like that's just something that cognitive psychologists have found over and over again is that asking them to do the mental flip can make it more confusing to the point where people would respond inaccurately because they don't understand what you're asking. So when you said that the difficulties changed, what were you looking
Mm-hmm.
at specifically?
We were using an IRT, and that would be I was just describing it as like, what do you mean like, specifically? Like just
Um,
like the overall difficulty of each item as real like the beta value, I think.
the IRT difficulty, like where it was
Mm-hmm.
located on the trait. Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, so you would expect them to, if you didn't reverse score, right, you'd expect them to move because of that. But you're saying even after you reverse scored, they were no longer in the same place on the trait?
So they were always reverse scored. It's just that between like the first version and the second version, we like swapped out a couple words. So
Mm.
like instead of like table, you could put like another synonym.
And so the ones that changed the most were the ones that you removed negative things. Yes, I'm not at all surprised
The
by that.
well, the ones that changed. Sorry, this is beside the ones that changed the most were the ones that were reverse coded. So
Mm.
where respondents are supposed to disagree with it, which I think is what you're saying about like it's confusing to disagree with a statement when you're agreeing with all the other ones.
Yes, and just expressing that, making sure that you're still within the same continua, right? Does low mean the absence of high, or does low mean something in the opposite direction? Those are two
Yeah.
different things. That's the problem. Sorry, I just saw the chat window here. I'm probably a few minutes behind on this. Construct maps related to item map, quite possibly. Is by item map, do you mean like a set of, like we need so many items that measure X and so many items that measure Y? Is it that kind of map? Okay, by the construct map definition, you would need to have a separate map for each of those. If something measures X, that's one construct. If something measures Y, it's another. And lumping them back together again would not be a single unidimensional construct. So even if the test is intended to be lumped back together, that would not be consistent with the way that we're thinking about it now, as where there's each separate construct. Other question, direction of causality, is because we're doing the approach of the reflective model. Um, I'm going to say yes. I think that this is presupposing indicators that are reflective rather than formative. As I mentioned over email yesterday, I added a new article to try and get at that distinction. That's something that's going to come up in lecture 2. So I'm going to put a pin in that for now because I'll have pictures to go with that idea that will help clarify what's reflective versus formative. But this process is the idea that I have this trait and the trait causes the way that I answer these questions. And so the issue is, what questions do I ask to best get at someone standing on the trait without confusing them by making them say, am I not unhappy? Wait, does that mean I'm happy? That sort of process. All right, so sorry, I apologize for being getting sidetracked from the chat window. Other questions? Okay, so the next few slides are probably one of my favorite parts of this whole class. I have been involved in a lot of instrument development research. I don't know how. It just sort of like fell into my lap. When I worked at the University of Kansas, which is where I did my PhD, I was a graduate research assistant for the Beach Center on Disability, and they were in the process of making a bunch of new measures. And so I got in on a lot of meetings, a whole lot of meetings, focusing on that process. But fortunately, some papers coming out of that too. My most cited article ever by a considerable margin is my contributions to the Heartland Forgiveness Scale. Just in case any of you were going to ask me about it, I know diddly squat about forgiveness. I am not really a psychologist. I pretend to be one when it's convenient. But on that scale, the lead author is no longer in academia and the second author is dead. And I am the third author. And so I get a lot of requests about that scale. I don't know anything about forgiveness, people. I did the factor analysis. That was my contribution. Measuring one dimension, happy 1 to 7 is different than measuring unhappy -3 to happy 3. Yes, that is exactly what I mean. So you have to ask yourself when you're making your construct, what does it mean to have to be low? Is it that you're high in another direction, or is it the absence? So sad is opposite of happy. You can just be like low on happiness, right? There's classic work looking at positive affect versus negative affect, whether it's one thing or two things. That's the kind of issue that we're talking about here. But anywho, I have actual items from previous research. So I want to encourage you to learn from mistakes of the projects I've been involved with and don't make these mistakes yourself. So here we go. So here's some example items that are problematic. We want to talk about why. How important to you is it that? And you have 5 choices, ranging from, say, only a little important all the way up to critically important. Don't remember the exact anchors, but that's close enough for what we're doing. How important is it to you that my family members have good relationships with extended family members, for example, grandparents, in laws, etc.? So, what's potentially problematic about this item? What do you think? Parentheses, says Kayla. Correct. What happens if I think it's important that I have good relationships with my grandparents, but I don't care about my in laws? Sorry, Nana, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking hypothetically. Don't want to get in trouble just in case they're part of my YouTube network. But yeah, what if you disagree? So, parentheses or EGs are often used to try and clarify a term, but in doing so can introduce ambiguity. Because if you have a different opinion about one example than another, how do you answer the question? So this item was one of the lower discriminating items in terms of its relationship to the trait, and I think this parenthetical was why. This is actually from the Family Quality of Life Scale as part of the Beach Center on Disability, some of my graduate work. Here's another item that was problematic, but for a different reason. How important is it to you that your family is physically healthy? On a 1 to 5 scale, let's do a quick answer. How important is it to you guys that your family is physically healthy? Very timely question considering the pandemic that's raging. Can I get a vote? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 point scale. 5. Yeah. Pretty much, if unless you're a monster who hates your family, you're picking 5, right? Who doesn't want their family to be healthy? So this is an item that's going to have no distribution. It's going to be a constant. So it's not going to be helpful in most samples. So what would be more helpful then? How do you know that someone is physically healthy, or what behaviors or opportunities do you need to stay healthy? Right? If you can back it down, like how important is it to you that your family can see a doctor whenever they need to? How important is it that your family has health insurance? How important is it that your health insurance has a low deductible, right? Like there's a million things that you could sort of back out of this that people could potentially say, oh, that part's not so important, but this part is critically important. So an item like this is probably not going to have a lot of variability, which means that it isn't going to show covariability with other items, and it's going to look bad for that reason, even if it's very related to the trait. So it's kind of a give me. All right, here's a different scale. This is not the Beach Center. This is a separate project, but also during graduate school. What is the quality of the relationship that you have with your children, guys? Okay, let's see those answers. Unbalanced responses. Excellent. Now I want you to answer the question. Your children, guys, you know, those ones? No children. Yeah. Does anyone here have kids? Just me? No kids? I thought there was one person. Nobody? I have a puppy. Okay. Fair enough. But we meant human children for the purposes of this, but I know a lot of people think of their pets as their children. Yes. So there's a couple problems with this. Number one is what the hell am I going to say if I don't have kids? Because if that's the case, I don't have an answer. So I could think, well, what about like my latent children? Like if I were to have children, would I think it's how good of my relationship would be? Well, before I had a kid, I thought I was going to be an awesome mom all the time. Not so much, as it turns out in practice. I'm actually pretty terrible as a mom. My only goal is to keep him alive every day, and every day that that happens, I feel myself that I have a success. That's the bar that I have. So yes, there needs to be a not applicable, right? Skip logic or display logic. There needs to be something that indicates this response, this question doesn't apply to me. If you don't give them that option, they will make shit up and it will ruin your data. Um, the question then becomes, all right, what if you have a not applicable response? What do we do with those responses? There is a relatively new measurement model that has been developed. It's on our syllabus. I hope I have time to get to it, and it's designed for this situation. It's actually a hybrid of a partial credit model for ordinal responses and a nominal model for unordered responses, to where you can actually take the not applicable or missing responses and locate that as another option onto the trait. So it turns out there is a model for that too, which I think is very applicable in a lot of situations, including this one. So the take home here, make sure that you have covered the full response space, including does not apply or I don't want to tell you as possible answers. If you're asking sensitive questions, the latter might be imperative. And the last one, I'm not making this shit up, I swear. To what extent did others make it difficult for you to engage in various activities before your imprisonment? Now, leaving aside the fact that we're not in prison, this was obviously a very different sample. Um, the correct answer to this is what? Who's others? What are my activities? I don't even know what that means. Correct. That is correct. Now, if you view this from a lens of poor influences, right? This could be something like, to what extent do other friends of yours get in trouble? And that makes it more likely for you to get in trouble. Or it could be positive influences. To what extent do people, are the people in your life law-abiding citizens who make good choices, right? Like, I don't even know what this means. Yeah, so very vague references. These are sort of extreme examples. Let me show you some other ones that came from previous research. I have been talking about this for years and no one has taken me up on it that I know of. If you're interested in what I think is a relatively straightforward scale to tackle, this one. The difficulties in emotion regulation scale. I've had several students pick this scale for their projects. It's supposed to be 6 different subscales. Only 4 of them actually hold together upon factor analysis, and I think I know why. So there is, for instance, one of the subscales, which is lack of emotional awareness, consists of only reverse coded items. So if you just look at these items, I pay attention to how I feel. I am attentive to my feelings. I care about what I'm feeling. When I'm upset, I acknowledge my emotions, right? These are like coping types of things, like more is better. But the rest of the scale is phrased as difficulties, and so they flip them. But unlike all of the other subscales that have some mix of reverse coded and not, this is all reverse. So if these items hold together, if their pattern of correlation suggests that they're all measuring something in common, we don't know if it's a lack of emotional awareness as intended or the fact that they're all reverse coded. They're confounded. Another issue is the stem when I'm upset. So if you look at the item numbers on here, here's item 1, 4, 5, 7, 9. Here's 3 over here, 2, 6, 8. The first items on the scale have this general reference. I care about my feelings. I don't know how I'm feeling. But then all of a sudden it switches to when I'm upset, dot, 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 dot. Well, I may have a very different perspective on how I respond to things sort of in general versus when I'm upset, right? And when you start the scale with one frame of reference, which is general, and then all of a sudden you switch, you're asking about two different things. So this seems like this would be a relatively easy set of problems to remedy with a revision to the scale. Make every item consistent with when I'm upset, or take it away, one of the two, and make it so that we don't have reverse coded items sort of randomly scattered across, but then all in one subscale. Believe it or not, you actually can fix this. This is something to where you could decide as a project to create another version of someone's scale that fixes these problems, just like what who was talking about that? Andrea, that was you. You had decided to deliberately modify the wording of a scale and see what happened. You can fix this. So as an example, a paper published in 2016 was actually a class project from Charlie Davidson, previous graduate of the University of Nebraska. And this was a scale measuring schizophrenic and schizotypy, think I'm behavior, uh, types of paranoia and delusions is a lot of these items. And he had noted something very somewhat problematic with the way that the items were worded, whether or not they were referring to you or I. And this was confounded across the different subscales. So, for instance, this factor measuring, I think it's cognitive perceptions or something like that, is predominantly you, whereas some of these are others ones are I. So that's an easy fix, right? You can change the wording to say I rather than you. And so this was a project that he actually did. He collected several samples of undergraduates and played around with different choices for the you versus I and whatnot, and actually found that fixing the problem, making everything internally consistent, related to better psychometrics. So he actually took this upon and we got it published. So it's a nice thing. So just know that when you see scales that you see these sorts of problems and things, you can try to fix it. Just because the so and so scale is what everyone has been used doesn't prohibit you from trying to make a better version or a revised version that tackles these issues. And whether or not something matters, like whether or not it should be you versus I, for instance, that's an empirical question. That's where you could treat scale development like any other kind of research project, and you could randomly assign people. Some people get the version that has you and some people get the version that has I, and you can look at things like item statistics, correlations between items, fit to the latent trait model, and so forth. So if you ever find yourself in a position where you're not sure which way something should go, make a study and figure it out. So, all right. So thoughts, questions on any of that? All right. So, in terms of deciding how many responses that you need and what they should say, this is a challenging process. And there's a whole field of research known as survey research methodology, groups of people that study empirically the effect of what it means to change the anchors of your scale, to have them labeled or not labeled, to have 5 points instead of 7 points, and that kind of thing. And so, there's not necessarily prescriptive advice that's going to fit all situations, it depends on a lot of factors. but you would want to anticipate potential revisions as you go through this process to what your anchors should say. So, as one example, in the My Family is Physically Healthy, that scale, the family quality of life scale, the original anchors were something like not at all important up to, and it stopped at like very important. Well, in that initial sample, everybody picked either the highest category or their second highest category. Nobody said anything was not important at all. So upon revising the scale, we changed some of the items, but we also changed the response format to where like unimportant was not on there anymore. And we tried to spread out what very meant. So I think the final version has like critically important as one step above very, for instance, because we knew that people were packing themselves into that upper end and we wanted to find some way to distribute them. So response options is something else to consider in addition to just the items. Here's an example of what I think are good sets of response options, and notably, they all came from the same scale. So I had a student looking at confidence or willingness to share religious beliefs as a trait, and here's one item. How confident do you feel, ranging from not at all to totally? How often do you engage in this behavior, ranging from never to every day? And how good are you are talking about your beliefs? So note that not only do these responses have different numbers of options, but they're completely different, right? They are specific to the item. This is okay. I would go a step further. Not only is this okay, this is desirable. Once you free yourself from the add shit up model, right? That you have to have all the items have to be on the same 1 to 5 scale and they all have to have the same anchors because we're going to sum them and we're going to take those scores and do stuff with them. Once you free yourself from that, you can see that each of these is going to be placed on the latent trait metric, and each of these response options is going to be at a different point. They don't have to match, and there's probably good reasons in which they shouldn't match. For some types of items, the most you could do it is every day. For other types of items, the most you could do it is every hour, right? Like if you have an item, how often do you go to the dentist? What would you say is often? Like more than twice a year, right? How often do you check social media? More than twice a minute? These are different behaviors on different time scales, and everybody's now like, she mentioned my phone. Can I look down at it without her noticing? No, you cannot. That is, I can tell the eyes. It's a dead giveaway, but that's all right. I told you you could multitask in this class. But point being, right, different items would have different response formats. What often means the more you can specify that, I think the better off you'll be. They don't all have to match, and they don't all have to have the same number of levels. However many it takes to differentiate, but not duplicate. Adding more if people can't tell the difference isn't going to help. Um, Here's what I say not to do. Don't leave them blank. If you don't know what two means, how are they supposed to know what two means? So different people have different opinions about this, but I don't think you should leave them blank. Ultimately, that's an empirical question. Where's Alfonso? Are you still on here? I think he may have left the building for a minute. He has a study looking at this empirically where he randomly assigned people to have two different versions of a scale he was telling me about. So we'll ask him more about that if he comes back. Looks like folks, not just me, are having internet issues today. But I am not a fan of leaving things blank. I think that if you define your anchors, they should be able to figure out where they stand. So here's just a list of different response formats and what kind of measurement model would go with them. This is not an exhaustive list for sure, but these are the most common ones. One thing that I will say is that there are measurement models for other kinds of formats, but you want to avoid formats that don't have variance. So things like rankings, those you can fit measurement models to, but you're going to have a lot more problems. I would avoid those kinds of response options if possible. So putting it all together, what we're doing in this class, measurement models that believe that we have latent traits that are continuous, Latent means unobserved. So there's no way of directly observing them. We have to have some kind of observed behavior that we're going to say the trait caused, and we measure those observed behaviors instead. There's a whole lot of steps that go into the process of designing an instrument. And if you are in the situation where you're using someone else's instrument, you still want to go through the steps to verify the dimensionality, the reliability, and ultimately then the validity as an end product of those things. It's not just like, well, this is someone's scale and it's been validated, so I can use it as is. You'd be surprised at how often people's structures don't actually match what it's supposed to be. So I hope that this will be immediately relevant to you in your research because working with latent constructs is pretty common in the social sciences. So question from the audience. What if you have different response options? Would you need separate models? No, you do not need separate models. So you can have a trait that is measured by one binary item, two items that have three categories, one item that has five categories, and response time that has a continuum. Totally fine. So they don't all have to match even within one scale. Sure. All right. Other questions? All right. Then I'm going to call this lecture done for now. I've got lecture 2 to